This video is an introduction to American modernism. Be sure that you're taking notes on your notes template either during or after the video, and then submit that notes template to Canvas. To begin, modernism is a genre of American writing that was popular after World War I. The war lasted from about 1914 to 1918, and after that war ended in 1918, modernism then remained popular through about 1940. The second point I have here is that modernism was inspired by the horrifying events of World War I. These horrifying events, like trench warfare and just the concept of the entire world being at war with each other, caused people to question the world itself and what is becoming of it. What is this crazy place that we live in? Modernist stories then focus on portraying the decline of civilization, but not necessarily trying to fix it. So we might look for some morality, or we might look for some big overall lessons from these modernist stories, but we might not always be able to say much other than the world is not necessarily a great place to be. You might want to pause the video here to take a look at the differences between the pre-modern world and the modern world. So the pre-modern world, or before World War I, is kind of like what we've been looking at with the yellow wallpaper and our Chopin short stories. That world was more ordered, it seemed meaningful, people were more optimistic, faith-centered, and focused on the ideas of morality and values. I mean, even though they might have valued men in one sphere and women in the domestic sphere, you still had the idea that that was the moral thing to be doing, and a clear sense of an American identity as this new and very successful country. But the modern world then splits this, right? So if we have World War I here that would split those two worlds, then the modern world is the exact opposite of that. So you have more of a chaotic world, a futile world, very pessimistic. You see a loss of faith and the collapse of morality, and a lot of more people turning to recklessness or disillusionment. Disillusionment is the idea that something used to look great and now you've kind of realized it's not that great. So think about all of those young men and young boys and men who had gone to fight in World War I, had grown up seeing the world as this, such a meaningful and optimistic place. When they come back from World War I, they see the world more like this and feel disillusioned at America or life in America or the American dream. The authors that we are going to read from the modernist period are described as the lost generation, and that's considered the generation that came of age during World War I, mostly the boys and the men who actually went to fight in the war and who saw firsthand how atrocious and horrifying death on that world scale would look like. Those young men and boys thought that their experience in World War I alienated them from their parents' positive values and expectations. That's like the chart we looked at a couple slides ago, the difference between the pre-modern world and the modernist world. These men who came back to the U.S. having experienced crazy, horrifying things like trench warfare now feel like everyone who stayed in the U.S. is super positive and happy, yet anyone coming back from World War I is now disillusioned and doesn't fit in the same places they used to fit in. So that lost generation became very cynical and pessimistic in contrast to their parents or their grandparents or their elders. And the job of the lost generation was to search for new values or ways to fit their experiences of the world into what their parents or what their grandparents thought. And you can see how that wouldn't be the exact same thing. And they might have trouble finding people who empathize with them or who understand what kind of horrific experiences they had been through. One of the unfortunate outcomes of the lost generation feeling so lost or feeling so out of place back in American culture is that many of them turned to reckless living. So when we read The Great Gatsby, you're going to see a lot of that effect on society, turning to drinking and to partying and fast driving, jumping in and out of relationships, being afraid of commitment. And all of that was a very real product of these young boys and men coming back from war and not really knowing how to deal with life anymore. we could see now that maybe a lot of this was PTSD, and we know a lot more about the effects of war on people's psyche and mentality. And it could very well be that a lot of these young men and boys of the lost generation were suffering from PTSD, but at the time we didn't really have a word for that yet. Here are some really famous members of the lost generation. If any of you have seen the movie Midnight in Paris, that includes a lot of the lost generation and their influences coming in as characters in that movie. So F. Scott Fitzgerald, we're going to read The Great Gatsby. We have Ernest Hemingway. His most famous novel is probably The Sun Also Rises. And we might read some of his short stories. We'll have some poetry by Gertrude Stein, might have some poetry by T.S. Eliot. And then I put Pablo Picasso here just because he was such an influence for those members of the lost generation. And we had other artists such as Salvador Dali as well. And we might talk a little bit about how some of those artistic influences of, fragmentation, and you can see how this person is kind of pieced together but not totally whole, just like the lost generation. We'll talk about how some of that art and literature connects. Here are some important characteristics of modernist literature for you to keep in mind. The first one is disillusionment, and the idea that the world used to look like such an amazing place where dreams could come true, and now it really doesn't, and we feel disillusioned at the prospect that someone could pursue their dreams or the American dream could come true at any point. Pessimism and pointing out the negatives of society or the decline of civilization. Making sense of a broken world, so seeing things that look horrible or look pessimistic, and then figuring out how that can make sense in one's brain. Embracing fears of humanity's darkness, and not being afraid to talk about how dark the world could be, kind of like what you would see during a war. And a lot of the time, our modernist literature is going to be from the first-person perspective, including The Great Gatsby, and the idea that then you can kind of better get into someone's head and figure out how they are making sense of this broken world. So those are all the notes I have for you on this video. Be sure you finish up your notes template and feel free to send me any questions via email or come find me at school if you have any. Otherwise, we'll review this in class together.